Felisberto Hernandez. 2. The fantastic strangeness of daily life. An original, unstructured, self-fictional, strange, highly humoristic narrator. A writer who writes like no other, the fantastic Felisberto. In this article, stages and characteristics of his work, along with a literary analysis of his short story Muebles, El Canario, the Canary, Furniture Shop. By Fernando Chelle. In the last issue of Vada Nuevo magazine, we found the first part of a study on the works of the Uruguayan writer Felisberto Hernandez. The objective of the mentioned article was to analyze the reception of Hernandez's works among literary critics and writers through history. In this article, you will find an analysis on the different stages of his works and its main characteristics, as well as an analysis to one of his most famous stories, The Canary, Furniture Shop. The literary works of Felisberto Hernandez can be divided in 3 stages. A. Initiation, from his first 4 books, Fulano de Tal, 1925, Libro sin tapas, 1929, La Cara de Ana, 1930, and La Envenenada, 1931. B. Maturity, a stage that includes Por los tiempos de Clemente Colling, 1942, and El Caballo Perdido, 1943. C. Final stage, which includes the rest of his works, Tierras de la Memoria, published after his death in 1965, Nadie Incendia las Lamparas, 1947, Las Hortensias, 1949, Y la Casa Inundada, 1960. To this classification in stages, we must add other works and fragments that belong to other periods which were published in a posthumous way, in Diario del Sinvergüenza, Diary of a Shameless Man, and Ultimas Inventions, Last Inventions published by Editorial Arca in 1974. In a different publication by Editorial Arca in 1969 titled Primeras Inventions, First Inventions, we can find, besides his first 4 books, 4 unpublished short stories, and other short stories published in newspapers, as well as 3 poems from the years 1932 and 1934. Felisberto had an incursion in the lyric genre, as well as in the drama. He wrote short plays, but Felisberto did not keep working those genres. Characteristics of the work of Felisberto Hernandez. The first thing we notice when we face any of Felisberto's works is the fact that we are in front of an original narrator, whom stories do not follow the traditional tracks of narrative organization. His stories seem to lack a solid structure to hold them, they are built through the association of ideas and motivations, and most of them do not have a concluding end. The internal atmospheres of his tales are strange, the objects seem to have a life of their own, the parts of the bodies seem to be independent, reality meets fantasy, and everything is expressed with a simple and colloquial language with big doses of humor. In his stories, we can also remark the repetition of the topics or motivations, specifically, the events that occur to a traveling pianist. It is very important to note that the narrative material worked by Felisberto was mostly taken from real life. In most of his stories, we can say there is a very strong self-biographic component, because Felisberto was a traveling pianist himself, who roamed around small cities inside Uruguay and Argentina playing concerts. Hernandez found a way to use his reality as a source of inspiration for his literature. He took historical elements and turned them into literary elements from a retrospective view where the memories play a key role. The memories of those little cities and towns, with their humble theaters, trading places, and parks, can be found in his tales. You will never find a precise identification of a determined place, for example, the action in stories as El Balcón, the balcony, and El Cocodrilo, the crocodile, might as well happen in Rocha or in Florida, as well as Mercedes, just to name 3 similar cities to those in which Felisberto published his first works. Maybe, the easiest place to identify can be found in Por los tiempos de Clemente Colling, where the manners of the zone of El Prado in Montevideo and the route of the 42nd tramway are recreated, but even this determined place works in function of the evocation, and does not answer the need to recreate geographical or historical aspects, because the interest point of this story are the characters' memories. This notorious self-biographic component in Felisberto's works can be named self-fiction. It's linked directly to the style the author decided to give his stories. We only can see a third-person narrator in a few of these stories. The vast majority of his stories are told using a first-person narrator. This characteristic gives his stories a sober, colloquial, informal tone. Felisberto did the transmutation of the historical elements into literary elements with total simplicity, using everyday words, direct and easy to understand, leaving aside the more complex and rhetorical ones. This conversational style, not typical of the academic circle, was one of the main targets where the critics attacked his works, accusing him of having a limited vocabulary. Maybe these critics, used to their own stylistic parameters, were not able to appreciate the use of an adequate vocabulary for the tone of Felisberto's stories, characters, and situations, which gives the reader a clear feeling of naturalness and spontaneity. Linked to the first-person voice, the narrated stories always refer to the narrator's own time, just the same way it happens with space. The time in the Felisbertian narrations is typically undetermined. We know, for the use of certain grammar tenses, that the foretold stories happened in the past. Some stories refer to facts, places, and characters that Felisberto seems to have taken from his childhood and others from his mature age, but in the regular evocations in his stories, the time seems to dilute, and the events in his stories are just events that happened before the moment of the narration. One of the most noticeable characteristics in the literature of Felisberto is a small dose of humor. Humor, comedy, as Calvino said, transfigures the bitterness of a life knit of defeats. Humor, in the works of Felisberto, allows absurdity of certain situations, dissolving events that otherwise might be considered distressful or painful if they were given a different literary treatment. Vital situations, as those faced by the protagonists in The Crocodile or The Canary, Furniture Shop, are not humoristic per se, they are quite the opposite. Humor becomes the vehicle that allows transit in a path of confusion and discomfort. Another particular characteristic in Felisberto's narrative is the treatment given to objects and the parts of the body. In By the Times of Clementi Colling, the narrator character says, "During that time, my attention stopped in those things in the background." This implies a different look on things, where he tries to unravel its mysteries, its secret and unexplainable functionality from a rational point of view. In these stories, objects seem to have their own life, to have a persona, and are not just there for the utilitarian use that mankind gives them. Something similar, but in an inverse way, happens to the parts of the body which are treated like mere objects. There is a not so common look on the human body, and its parts seem to be autonomous objects with a life of their own. We can perceive this in many stories, but this perk is more noticeable in Diary of a Shameless Man, where the narrator has a dialogue with his own body. We can see how this Felisbertian world establishes a very strange link between unanimated things and living beings turned into objects. Fantasy. To put it very briefly, we say fantastic literature are those stories that show events that the reader cannot explain, recurring to interpretations that start from a possible reality. The fantastic story shows the reader some strange, surprising event in the midst of circumstances that can be called normal. Facing this, the reader may feel doubts, uncertainty, and surprise, but he must accept what is being told possible in the fiction, even if these events are unexplainable from a rational point of view. There has been a lot of discussion by critics and writers about including or not the literature of Felisberto Hernández within the fantastic genre. Some of them do not hesitate to call it fantastic, others accept the qualification, but with certain restrictions, and there are those who definitely refuse to place him within this category. I believe that the problem here lies in the traditional eagerness, not only by critics, of wanting to match works of art to models, schools, or canonical tendencies. This classificatory intention can be very useful in establishing similarities and differences between certain artistic manifestations, but we must understand that works are independent expression of certain molds. Apart from this, we cannot refer to the whole of Hernández's work as belonging or not to the fantastic genre. There are some stories that undoubtedly have the characteristics that critics like Todorov attribute to the fantastic genre, and we also find other stories that definitely cannot be classified into this genre. In a great number of his stories, Felisberto Hernández gives way to fantasy in the middle of situations that can be described as normal, real, plausible. Fantasy, in some of these narrations, is created with the same elements that make up the real world, which is approached in a different way. Felisberto generally introduces strangeness and fantasy in his texts using expressions or linguistic twists. For example, in that moment many things happened, it happened that, without it being a relationship of cause and effect between what was happening in the narration and what is going to happen next. Literary analysis. The text chosen for a literary analysis is The Canary, Furniture Shop, text included in the book Nobody Lit the Lamps, published by Editorial Sudamericana in Buenos Aires in 1947. The central topic of the story is the media invasion in favor of advertising, and the way it affects the privacy. When I wrote about the characteristics of Felisberto's works, I said that his stories do not follow the traditional narrative organization. I also said that his stories lack of a solid structure holding on them, and they are built through the association of ideas and motivations that, in the end, do not show a concluding ending. This is exactly what happens in the Canary furniture shop. When we analyze this work trying to determine his internal structure, we face the difficulty implied in separating unerringly the different moments that form the story. Anyway, in this short story we can appreciate a succession of chained events that are shown in a non-fluent way, and I will try to show the links of that chain. The first moment of the story happens when the main character of the story is coming back to his city and becomes the victim of an unusual, surprising and weird event, as he gets a substance injected in his arm without his consent. We can determine a second moment, remember this is just for analysis purposes, and which begins when the character gets down the streetcar. The inner thoughts of the protagonist become the center of interest of this segment, the reflections about what just happened and the beginning of the weird and fantastic events that he suffered. The third part of the story is marked by the protagonist's efforts to nullify the effects of the injection inoculated to him. Finally, the fourth and last segment of the story consists on the ending, in which the protagonist dialogues with a man who is injecting some kids. The advertisement of this furniture company got me unaware. I was on a 1-month vacation in a nearby place and did not want to know what was happening in the city. When I arrived back, the weather was hot, and that same night I went to the beach. I was heading back to my room, and I was a bit upset for what had happened in the streetcar. I got on it at the beach and had to sit in one of the hallway seats. As the weather was still very hot, I had my coat on my knees and my arms were receiving the air, because I was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. The beginning of the story is abrupt. There is no introduction to place the character in a specific time or place before the action. We only have the words of the protagonist narrator. The first sentence of the story is very important, because it tells two things. On one side, the main theme of the story, advertisement. On the other hand, the attitude of the guy towards this advertisement, because the protagonist says, the advertisement got me unaware, at which we might understand that there is a way to be aware of the siege of the advertisement. We may find in this segment an implicit criticism towards the invasion of the media in the service of advertisement. The main character's will was not to know in this city because he was on vacation in a nearby place. Here we can appreciate, as I had told before, that there is not a precise identification of the places where actions take place. The place where he was on holiday was just a nearby place. If we take a look to the use of the tenses, we can appreciate that this homodiegetic narrator is talking from the future. The advertisement of this furniture company got me unaware. This is another Felisberto's characteristic. We had already pointed, the story he is telling belongs to the past, already happened. The main character says he went back to his room, not his house, and this is very meaningful. Remember when we talked about the strong self-biographical element in the works of Felisberto? Well, as a traveling pianist, he used to sleep in rooms of small hotels, which names are often referenced throughout his works. This seems to be one of those cases. But let's take a look on what happened in the streetcar. The main character sits in one of the hallway seats, with his coat on his knees and his arms in the air. The writer prepares the terrain for the events about to happen. Among the people around the hallway, there was one person who suddenly said to me, "Excuse me, please." And I quickly answered him, "Take it." But not only hadn't I understood what was going on, I also got afraid. Many things happened in that moment. First one of them was, even before he had not finished asking for my permission yet, before I had finished answering him, he was rubbing my naked arm with something cold that I do not know why, thought was saliva. And when I just had finished saying, "It's yours," I felt the sting and saw a big syringe with some letters. At the same time, a fat lady in a different seat said, "Go ahead." I must have done an abrupt movement with my arm because the man with the needle said, "Hey, I'll end up hurting you, just hold on." He was soon handling the syringe while the other passengers who had seen my face were laughing. Then he began to rub the arm of the fat lady while she looked at the operation with complacency. Despite the needle was big, it could throw just a small squirt with a spring stroke. Then I was able to read the yellow letters along the tube, the canary, furniture company. I was too embarrassed to ask what was it about, and I decided I would know the next day by the newspapers. There is a dialogue between the man who injects the passengers and the protagonist, and we, as readers, become some kind of standing witness of the scene going on. When the protagonist says, "Go ahead," he is not allowing the man to inject him. The protagonist probably thought that the man was asking him for a space so he could pass to a seat. He ignores these new advertisement strategies. With the sentence, "Many things happened in that moment," Felisberto begins to tell the absurd events that lead to fantasy. There is a contrast between the attitude of the protagonist and the attitude of the other passengers, which seem to know beforehand the advertising methods used by companies. On the other hand, the protagonist feels baffled, astonished, and scared by the events. Let's take a look at the different attitudes. For example, the protagonist makes a sudden movement with his arm, in total ignorance of what is going on, even taking the risk of getting hurt, while the fat woman, knowing the methodology, watched the operation with a pleasant look. The fat woman's attitude towards the facts is comical, but it is precisely that humorous treatment that Felisberto gives to the story which allows him to continue to tell about an absurd situation as if it were something normal. If we wanted to give the story a symbolic reading, we could see the tram as a representation of society and its behavior towards the arrival of a consuming society, marked by the omnipresence of different forms of advertising. In that reading, the protagonist is the exception, a stranger in the middle of smiling and alienated passengers adjusted to the social parameters. The fact of being the exception, apparently the only one who does not understand the situation, leads the character to feel ashamed, instead of encouraging him to ask what is it all about. But as soon as I got off of the tram I thought, it won't be a strengthener, this must be something that leaves visible consequences, if it is really an advertisement. However, I did not know for sure what it was about, but I was too tired and I became obstinate about not thinking about it. Anyway, I was sure that doping people with any drug was not allowed by law. Before falling asleep, I thought that, in the best of cases, they had wanted to produce a feeling of well-being or pleasure. I was still awake when I began to hear inside of me the tweets of a little bird. It did not have the quality of a remembered sound, neither the sound that comes from the outside. It was not normal, like some brand new sickness, but it had an ironic hue, as if the sickness was feeling happy and would have started to sing. When I mentioned fantastic literature, I said that it shows a fantastic happening to the reader, a strange event, surprising, amidst circumstances that can be called normal. You just have to take a look to the events that the main character suffers, without any explanation, to classify this story in this genre. Even if the protagonist is not among the general alienation of the people inside the tram, the social parameters do not cease conditioning him, because he is ashamed of being different anyway, of dissenting with the majority of the people, and, instead having a somehow precise reaction, he waits until he has got off of the bus to make hypotheses, some of them supernatural, about what just happened. Having read the words "the canary, furniture shop in the syringe" is what makes the protagonist suppose that it is some kind of advertisement, but he cannot conceive that an advertisement does not leave visible marks. He will soon begin to feel the real consequences of this injection. The sentence, "Anyway, I was sure that it was not allowed to dope the people with any drug," is very meaningful to me, because it is loaded with irony. Because, we must ask to ourselves, what are the limits for the advertisement invasion in a consumer society? What do drugs generate, and what does consumerism generate once advertisement has invaded the mind of the consumers? Both things generate a necessity, a desire, and finally a dependency. Both things are used sometimes by the individuals to fill gaps and getting temporary pleasure. The fantastic event begins just the moment before the main character falls asleep, when he begins to hear the tweet of a bird inside of his head. This event is deeply strange, but we as readers must accept what we are being told as possible inside this narrative fiction, even if it appears to be an unexplainable event, from a rationalist point of view. The character states that the bird's tweet is some kind of brand new sickness, and immediately after, Felisberto relies in one of his favorite artifices, the animation of concepts or objects. Even the feelings have an independent life of their own. In this particular case, the sickness suffered by the protagonist feels happy and begins to sing. This particular aspect, besides giving the sickness a life of its own, has a very oxymoronic, contradictory feeling, because sickness is the last element related to joy. These sensations passed quickly and immediately appeared something more concrete. I heard a voice in my head that said, "Hey ho, this is the canary, broadcasting, hey ho, special audition. People sensitized for this broadcastings, etc., etc. I was hearing all of this standing on my feet, barefoot, aside my bed and not daring to turn the lights on. I had jumped and stood still in that place. It seemed impossible that it sounded inside my head. I went back to my bed and decided to wait. Now they were broadcasting indications about the payment in monthly fees in the furniture shop, the Canary. And then they suddenly said, as a first issue, we will broadcast a tango titled. After the tweet of the little bird comes a sound that the protagonist considers more concrete. It is a human voice, a radio announcer who sounds inside his head as the bird tweets. The protagonist leaves aside the narrative voice and reproduces what the radio announcer is saying, leaving the protagonist in the role of the listener. It is a radio broadcast, and the name of the radio station has by chance the same name that the needle in the tram had, the Canary. The radio announcer is talking about a special audition, referencing people who have been sensitized to listen to the aforementioned broadcasts, the injected ones. Later, the narrator makes a description of himself, where he declares himself scared, not daring to turn the lights on, baffled, without believing what was happening. We learned, and now again by the voice of the character, that the radio is an advertising tool at the service of the furniture shop, the Canary, where they announce the benefits that customers have, such as the possibility of paying the furniture in monthly fees. The voice of the announcer appears again to announce the first musical number of the broadcast. It is the tango, which will take the character to the ultimate desperation. There is a punctual fact here that shows the dislike that the protagonist feels for the tango. The voice of the announcer does not even specify a particular tango, but simply says, tango, which would show that rejection includes all musical manifestations of that musical genre. As I said before, the works of FELISBERTO HERNÁNDEZ are so strongly influenced by the author's own life that I did a research about his views on tango, but did not find any information about that specific topic. Anyway, there is one important fact. In the year of 1943, one of his jobs in the Asociación de Radio Uruguaya de Autores, Uruguayan Authors Radio Association, was to listen radio during entire hours, writing on a paper the songs that had been played, so the Authors Association could manage the payment of the copyright. Probably, many of the broadcasted songs were tangos, I do not know, but surely, doing that almost Kafkaesque job ended up with him hating radio and advertisement. Exasperated, I got under a thick blanket, then I heard everything more clearly, for the blanket attenuated the noise of the street and I perceived better what was happening inside my head. Immediately I took off the blanket and began to walk around the room. This relieved me a little, but I had something like a secret stubbornness in hearing and complaining about my misfortune. I went to bed again, and when I grabbed the bars of the bed, I heard the tango more clearly. The desperation for escaping away of the tango is what makes the character go under the blanket, but it happens that he cannot escape. It is an internal noise, and the only thing he achieves is hearing the sounds inside his head more clearly. When he is under the blanket, he is totally isolated from the surrounding world, and linked exclusively to the radio station and the broadcast and the media manipulation. Desperation can be noticed in the constant change of moods of the main character. He does not know if he should stay under the blanket, leave his bed, walk the room or go back to bed. There is a paradoxical situation. Even if the character is suffering having to hear the broadcasts, he wants to hear it and complain about his misfortune. There is also an absurd humoristic situation. When the main character grabs the bars of the bed, everything makes the readers suppose that the bars were made of metal, because they cause that the tango is heard more clearly because they work as some kind of antenna. After a while I found myself in the street again. I was looking for other noises that attenuated the one that I was hearing inside my head. I thought about buying a newspaper to inform myself about the radio station address to ask them what I had to do to nullify the effect of the injection. But a tram came and I took it. In a few moments the tram passed by a place where the tracks were in poor condition, and the big noise relieved me of another tango they were playing now, but suddenly I looked into the streetcar and saw another man with another syringe. He was injecting children who were sitting in crossed seats. I went there and asked him what I had to do to cancel the effect of an injection they applied on me an hour ago. Audition keeps disturbing the character who now, in desperation, decides to leave his house looking for a solution. His discomfort is so bad that he feels he is just looking for other noises to attenuate the internal noise that is giving him a bad time. Just as he thought while being on the tram, he wants to look for information on the newspapers, but now he does not intend to make clear what the injection is all about, because he totally knows it for sure now. He wants to find the address of the radio station, as all he thinks about in this moment is in how to nullify the effect of this annoying injection. Desperation leads him to abandon that idea too, and to take a tram again. For a moment, temporarily, he achieved the goal he had set out on the street, to soften his head with other noises, since the tram passed through a place where the roads were in poor condition and the great noise relieved me of another tango they played. Now, getting on the tram ends up being beneficial, since there he meets another employee of this large multidisciplinary corporation called the Canary, which is injecting children, and from which he will obtain first-hand information. As we can see, advertisement doses are not restricted to a certain age group, and even the most socially vulnerable are sensitized through this perverse methodology. He looked at me with an expression of sapphire and said, "Don't you like the broadcast?" "Not at all. Just wait for a moment, a radio novel should begin soon." "Awful," I said. He kept injecting and shaking his head, forming a smile. I did not hear the tango anymore. Now they were talking again about furniture. At last, the man with the syringe told me, "Sir, the advertisement of the pills, the Canary, has appeared in every newspaper. If you don't like the broadcast, you just take one of them, and that's it. But all the drugstores are closed right now, and I'm going mad." In that moment, I had an announcement. And now we will hear a poem called My Dear Couch, a sonnet written specially for the furniture shop, the Canary. After that, the man with the syringe approached me to talk to my ears and said, "I'm going to fix your problem in a different way. I'll charge you 1 peso because I see the face of an honest man in yours. If you tell anybody about this, I'd lose my job, for it's better for the company that the pills are sold." I hurried him to tell me the secret. Then he opened his hand and said, "Bring on the peso." And I gave it to him and he added, "Wash your feet on hot water." And here we reach the outcome of the story, where the predominant element is the protagonist narrator and the Canary's worker. The situation faced by these two characters can be compared to the one we witnessed on the first tram, where the other passengers were smiling because of the ignorance of the main character. Here, this worker smiles and is thrilled to find someone who not only seems to be outside the consumption society, but also wants to get rid of it. The worker seems amazed of how little informed is this character, because the solution to his problems is in every newspaper. To end the broadcastings of broadcast station, the Canary, where the furniture shop, the Canary, advertises its products, people must take pills named the Canary. This monopolist trademark produces the illness and also the cure, and with that marketing methodology, if the company does not sell the furniture, at least will get a certain profit from selling the pills calmly, because the ordinary people seems to be pleased and satisfied with this kind of services. Undoubtedly, there is a strong criticism implicit in this story, not only against the media, but also against consumption society. For us, 21st century readers, it is nothing new to see a certain trademark trying to monopolize certain products or services, but almost 70 years ago, when this short story was written, this situation was very unlikely to happen. The character cannot afford the situation anymore. He even thinks that he is going crazy with such bombing of advertisement, novels in episodes, tangos, and silly, ridiculous poetry. At the end of the story, in a very ironic way, the worker gives the protagonist an alternative solution to his suffering. Irony can be seen in the fact that the employee of the Canary talks about honesty at the same time that he trespasses his functions. On the other hand, he is not doing any favor or solidary action. Instead, he is taking advantage of the protagonist's despair for his own benefit. Once the character accepts the fraudulent transaction for the agreed fee, the words of the worker that contain the cure, the solution, the ultimate exit to his calm, wash your feet on hot water. It is a typical feature on FELISBERTOHERNÁNDEZ stories. The ending is not conclusive and seems abrupt. We don't know which of the possible options the main character is going to choose to end his misery, if he will fall on the trap of the monopoly built by the Canary buying the pills, or if he will choose the hot wash. As a conclusion, the Canary, furniture shop is a fantastic short story, completely anchored in a recognizable reality which allows us to enjoy, feel, and live the story. The topic has an amazing validity. Nowadays, more than ever, we should be prevented of the advertisement and propagandistic attacks, maybe in a different way than the protagonist suffered, but in an omnipresent way in our daily lives. Business monopolies are not new for us, 21st century readers, and neither are visual and noise pollution in our daily spaces. Advertisement is not exclusive from the TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, or spam mails. It can also be found on the street corners, delivered by promoters, in the mailboxes of the buildings, in the cinemas, in the shopping malls, and basically any place where there are potential consumers. Sad thing is, our reality lacks of these kinds of solution that are present in the fiction, and these problems are not solved with a hot water feet wash,